The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve just reported 298.7 million barrels. That sounds fine. It's not. By the end of this video, you'll know where the SPR's operational floor actually sits and why 298.7 million is already inside the danger band, not approaching it. You'll know the math behind an 8-week countdown to when the U.S. loses its ability to intervene in oil prices at scale. And you'll know why Iran just locked in a multi-year adversarial timeline that means the supply disruption will almost certainly outlast the reserve. If you don't understand what happens when the government's emergency oil tool runs dry while the supply disruption is still fully active, you'll misread the next WTI move. That's a structural price shift across your crude futures, XLE and USO, and you didn't see it coming. Let's start with what most people get wrong about the SPR. Most people picture it as a massive tank, deep, nearly bottomless, something the government taps when prices spike, and there's always more behind it. That's the wrong mental model. The SPR isn't a tank. It's 60 salt caverns carved into salt domes along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and Texas. And salt cavern storage has an operational floor. Back in the 1970s, the original sizing studies set 250 million barrels as the recommended minimum. Industry consensus ever since puts the operational floor, where pulling oil out gets harder and slower, between 250 and 300 million. The Department of Energy recently claimed the reserve can technically operate down to about 70 million barrels. But notice what that claim doesn't say. It doesn't say oil comes out fast. And for an emergency reserve, speed is the whole point. Below the 250 to 300 band, barrels can't flood the market fast enough to break a price spike. If it can't flood the market, it can't fight the market. So here's the number that matters. The DOE reported 298.7 million barrels as of August 10, 2026. At 298.7 million, the U.S. is already inside that band. The last time the reserve was at this level, Ronald Reagan was in his first term. That's 43 years ago. At 298.7 million barrels, the U.S. isn't approaching the danger zone. It entered it. So the question is, how fast is it draining towards the bottom of that band at 250 million? Because the answer to that just changed dramatically. Here's what changed. The previous week's draw was 2.8 million barrels. This week's draw was 6.1 million barrels. The largest weekly draw in 2 months. More than double in 7 days. That acceleration traces back to one release. Trump authorized a 172 million barrel release in March of 2026. The trigger was Strait of Hormuz supply disruptions. Tanker traffic through one of the world's most critical shipping choke points was under threat, and the U.S. needed barrels in the market to prevent a price shock. It isn't just the U.S. releasing. The IEA coordinated a 400 million barrel global response, and the U.S. is the most aggressive participant by volume. Here's where most get it wrong. If the U.S. is dumping barrels at this rate, why haven't oil prices collapsed? Because the Hormuz disruption is absorbing every barrel. The SPR drains fast. Prices stay elevated. Both things are true at once. Now do the math. 298.7 million barrels on hand. The bottom of the operational band at 250 million. That's 48.7 million barrels of usable rapid draw capacity remaining. Divide by 6.1 million barrels per week. That's approximately 8 weeks. 1 week of acceleration compressed the timeline from months away to right now. 8 weeks. That's the countdown to when large-scale draws from the SPR stop being a credible tool. The next question is obvious. Will the Hormuz disruption resolve before the reserve hits the floor? The answer depends on Iran, and Iran just answered it clearly. A senior advisor to Iran's parliament speaker stated publicly, with a specific date, that Iran will wait out the Trump administration. No negotiations until January 20th, 2029. Not talks are stalled, not negotiations are unlikely. A declared cutoff, January 2029. Most still operate on the assumption that international economic pressure will eventually force an adversary back to the table. Historically, it's often true. And talks have started and collapsed repeatedly this year. Oman, Geneva, a Qatar back channel as recently as July. That's exactly what makes this declaration different. After a year of on-again, off-again diplomacy, Tehran is telling you not to count on the next restart, publicly, with a date. And yes, there's an Oman brokered channel on Hormuz open right now. But Iran's price for reopening the strait is war reparations, sanctions relief, and unfrozen funds. That's not an exit. That's a number Washington won't pay. Put the two timelines side by side. SPR floor, approximately 8 weeks away. Iran negotiation window, approximately 130 weeks from now, at the earliest. That's not a gap. That's a canyon. The policy tool runs out roughly 120 weeks before the diplomatic window even opens. And here's what makes it worse. The allies in that 400 million barrel IEA release have already drawn down their own reserves managing this crisis. A second coordinated response requires members to have capacity left. Other members aren't far behind the US. The assumption that the coalition can repeat what it did in March of 2026 gets weaker every week. So here's the full picture. A policy tool that runs out in 8 weeks. A supply disruption with no diplomatic exit in sight. Coalition partners with shrinking capacity for a second response. That's not a temporary problem. The supply disruption will almost certainly outlast the SPR's usable capacity, and it won't be close. That means we need to think about what the crude market actually looks like structurally when the floor is hit and the government's intervention mechanism is gone. As the SPR falls through 250 million barrels, the US loses something most haven't priced yet. It doesn't just lose the barrels, it loses the credible threat of release. The market prices WTI, XLE, and USO with an assumption baked in. The US government can intervene. That belief suppresses crude even on quiet weeks. Here's what the futures curve hasn't priced. The floor date is in public Department of Energy data. Anyone with a weekly petroleum report and a calculator can run it. But futures positioning doesn't reflect that the intervention mechanism is losing its credibility. The market is still trading WTI as if the safety valve is fully intact. In approximately 8 weeks, it won't be. For American drivers, the ceiling on pump prices, the one the SPR's release capacity created, it comes off the same day. Below 250 million barrels, drawdown rates degrade. The reserve can still release oil, but not at the pace that breaks a price spike. What changes at the floor isn't just a barrel count. What changes is the pricing structure. When that intervention capacity stops being credible, crude price discovery around geopolitical events works differently. And it's functionally a one-way door. You can't replenish the SPR while a supply disruption is still active and prices are already elevated. The US is running an 8-week policy clock against a 130-week geopolitical lockout. Those two timelines collide. And when they do, WTI price discovery operates without its safety valve for the first time since the Hormuz disruption began. The SPR drains to the bottom of its operational band in approximately 8 weeks. Iran won't negotiate until 2029. The futures curve hasn't priced either of those facts together yet. That collision is a structural price event, not a temporary move. You now know the floor, you know the drain rate, and you know what happens when the policy clock runs out while the geopolitical lockout is still fully active. And the market hasn't priced any of it yet. Here's what understanding this story doesn't give you: the truth about price. It gives you a narrative, and narratives matter. But price is what tells you whether the narrative is true or not. The measured move is a framework for knowing the direction of price. It tells you whether this narrative is being confirmed by price or not. If you act on a story like this without that framework, you could be right about everything that you just heard and still be on the wrong side of a trade for days, weeks, or even months. That framework is what I teach. The traders in my community don't get trapped by bullish narratives. They know where a trend fails. And until it does, until price confirms it, they will trade a bearish trend until it fails, even if it is against a bullish narrative. They have a framework for reading it themselves. That's the process I teach every day at eminiaddict.com.